There is this point that often gets overlooked, which is that the American people enable circumstances like Guantanamo because we get afraid, we don't care, the place seems distant, the issue seems remote, what's it got to do with us? I was a law student intern in Mississippi in the summer of 1966, and there had been a major civil rights demonstration going on every night in the town of Grenada, Mississippi, led by Martin Luther King and his colleagues. I marched with them and got in the car I'd borrowed to drive back to the town where I was stationed, and I was on the interstate highway about 10 o'clock at night, and a Mississippi State police car went by me at very high speed with lights going. And then about 5 minutes later, a state police car came up behind me, and the car that had passed me had dropped back, and I was sandwiched between the two cars. And they pulled me over and began to question me about what I was doing, and was I doing civil rights work, and why was I in Mississippi making trouble. So they took me out of my car and put me in one of the patrol cars with two Mississippi State policemen in the front and two in the back, and the man in the back had a shotgun in his right hand, and in his left hand he had shotgun shells, which he was tossing up like this. And I got very nervous because 2 years before that, three young men named Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodwin, not far from where I then was, had been taken by the Neshoba County Sheriff on the pretext of having violated the law and taken out into a swamp and shot. So they drove me off, and I really thought that I was going to be put into a swamp someplace. But instead, they pulled up at a sign that said, I.W. Irby, Justice of the Peace. This man came out of the farmhouse where he lived in his night clothes, and the state policeman, who obviously knew him, said, we caught this fellow reckless driving on the interstate. And Mr. Irby said, well, then we'll have a trial. He took me into his court, which seemed to be a converted chicken coop or barn building of some kind, and asked me what I wanted to say. And I said that the Supreme Court had said that you had a right to one phone call to a lawyer. To my amazement, he said to these state policemen who were practically hopping up and down, they were so mad, well, boys, the Supreme Court does say he gets one call to a lawyer, so let's let him have that call.
Good evening. Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts.
The war on terrorism begins.
British and American cruise missiles began falling on Kabul.
Secretary Rumsfeld said that the U.S. Navy base in Cuba would be used to hold Taliban and al-Qaeda fighters.
The Military Commissions Act, signed by President Bush last month,
stripped the centuries-old right of detainees to challenge their detention in court.
The right known as habeas corpus.
Habeas corpus is probably our most important right. Every other right that we argue about, the right to free speech, the right to bear arms, it's all subsidiary in a profound sense to the right to be a free person, not to be picked up off the street by a policeman or anybody else and put away in some place, whether it's Guantanamo or any other place, and then told that the key has been thrown away. There's no way that my clients, all of whom were born and brought up in Algeria, most of whom had fundamentally high school educations, would have any basis to understand that American lawyers would take a case like this for free, that you were not an agent of the government. None of that had any particular root in any shared experience that they and we had. And so that was an additional impediment, just the notion that Americans who had imprisoned them could also be seeking to free them. What the Supreme Court said in Rasool and Hamdi in 2004 was that there had to be a much fairer process than existed, And they said that because it was essentially no process at all except the proposition that people could be held indefinitely without hearing or trial. The Bush administration, not wanting the courts to be involved any further in deciding the rights of people in Guantanamo, created within a matter of weeks a whole new process called combat status review tribunals, which were proceedings before a 3-judge military panel or tribunal in Cuba, where you'd be called in and they'd say, we have evidence here we can't show you that you're a terrorist, that you were seized in Bosnia, that you are affiliated with, associated with Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, or those that support and encourage Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. What do you say? And my clients would say, that's not right. I didn't do anything like that, and I don't know what evidence there could possibly be that suggests I did anything like that. Let me see the evidence. And the tribunal would say, we can't show you the evidence. It's classified secret. You're not entitled to see it. When Mr. Ada Deer wanted to be able to practice his religion, he refused to surrender his trousers because he could not, as a committed Muslim, pray in bare knees. And they came down the line taking trousers from men. Everybody gave them over, and they got to his cell. And the guys around him said, give the guards your trousers, they're going to beat you. And he said, no, I'm not going to give in. I have a right to pray, and I have to have my knees covered. So they brought something called an immediate reaction force team into his cell, and they tear gassed him and maced him, and then they tried to drag him out. But he had been a karate champion in Croatia and in Bosnia, and so he fought back. And as he fought back, they eventually subdued him because these were 5 or 6 guys in full riot gear with batons and masks, the whole thing that you see on SWAT teams, and beat him badly and dragged him out and threw him in the middle of the courtyard and kicked him and stepped on his head and induced something called Bell's palsy, which is a paralysis that can come and go in your facial muscles. Then later, in order to teach him a lesson, they came back and stuck his head in the toilet bowl until he thought he would drown. We were facing in the Boumediene case really 3 arguments. Did habeas exist in Guantanamo? After all, if it did Congress unequivocally strip it? If it did strip it, was that stripping unconstitutional because there was no adequate substitute for habeas provided by the Detainee Treatment Act process, reviewing what happened to these men in these combat status review tribunals?
We'll hear argument this morning in Case 06-1195, Boumediene versus Bush, and Case 06-1196, Elena versus United States.
Our decision in Boumediene and Bush was a 5-4 decision, and it could easily have been a 4-5 decision if Justice Kennedy had not authored the opinion and thrown his weight behind the decision, which was essentially to affirm what the Supreme Court had said in a more measured manner in 2004, that men in Guantanamo might have a right to habeas corpus. In the Boumediene decision, the court said unequivocally that they did have habeas corpus rights, and that for the first time in our history, Congress had unlawfully stripped those rights without providing an acceptable substitute. The lawyer who had trained me not to be out in the situation I was in Grenada at a motel, and miraculously he was in. And I talked to him, and he said, I can't help you. Nobody can help you out in that rural county late at night. If you don't somehow get out of custody tonight and get back to where you're staying, you may well be taken from that jail where they'll put you tonight, and we'll never find you. So we went back to the chicken coop courthouse. This man was obviously a farmer who doubled as a justice of the peace. And he convened the court, which was himself and the 4 state policemen and me, and asked them what the charge was, and they said I'd been reckless driving, weaving all over the state highway. And he asked me what I pleaded, and remembering the conversation I had just had, I said, well, it's not what they said, but I'm going to plead guilty anyway in order not to prolong this. And he said, all right, I'm fining you $20 and $1 court costs. I happen to have $20 in traveler's checks and $1 in cash in my pocket. I think it is fair to say that the Constitution rescued me by allowing me to make that one phone call that perhaps saved my life. And in the Boumediene case, we expected that habeas corpus would be involved, but we had no way to know whether it would take the number of years it did, the courts to which we'd have to visit, the challenges we'd have to overcome. What we knew there was an avenue there that was available, and if we could be resolute enough and imaginative enough, we could perhaps bring these men through, and that's what's happened. We hoped that what the Supreme Court said would lead to most of the men in Guantanamo being freed and Guantanamo being closed.